questions or put questions into the chat, because I'm happy to kind of make this a little bit more interactive. So you're welcome to do that. So first of all, what does API stand for? It is an application programming interface, which essentially my understanding is that this is just a way for two computers or applications to kind of connect or interface with each other. And so for Essence APIs specifically, in order to use those, you need to be an active Essence user because you need to be able to have permissions to access data within Essence. And so that's a sort of prerequisite, I should say, for being able to use the Essence API. And so if you for some reason maybe got this invitation forwarded to you and are not an active Essence user, it would be important to make sure that you have an active Essence account. And I've linked the user management page here and can also put it into the chat later on. But if you have trouble and it's not working, that would be kind of my first troubleshooting thing to check, is to make sure that you have current credentials for actually logging into the system. Okay, so I think the next question is like, why would you want to use one of these APIs? And I think there's a few potential reasons why. I'd be interested in hearing others if you have them. But in general, this will allow you to potentially pull data out of Essence without actually using the interactive application. So you might have a reason why, you don't want to log in and run something necessarily. You'd rather just kind of have it pulled. I think the second one here is probably what is most powerful about the APIs is it can allow you to automate repetitive daily data pulls. Well, not daily necessarily, but anything that would be a repetitive process of pulling data. And then to be able to import the data directly into another software application rather than the two-step process of downloading it out of Essence and then uploading it into another program. This is kind of doing that all in one step or pipeline. So those are the reasons that sort of came to my mind for why this could be useful to you all and why I have used the APIs in Essence. So how do you do this? Well, what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through it, and then if we have time and things are cooperating, we can kind of do a little demo within Essence itself as well. But I think first I just want to talk you through the process. So we'll start with the example of a time series query in Essence, because that's kind of the most typical one I think that a lot of people are going to be running. And the beginning of the process is the same as it would be for any other time that you're running a time series query within Essence. And so you're going to the query portal and you're choosing all of your query parameters. I've listed a few of them here, but anybody that has used Essence knows there's kind of a whole laundry list of available query fields in there. And so you can, set up any of those that are important for what you're trying to do. And then you click time series to run that query and generate a graph. So that part is all kind of the same as what you would do anyway. But the next part is where you can actually find the API. So you've generated your time series graph. It kind of pops up the graph. But to find the API, you need to go to the upper left-hand section of the screen has a few expandable menus, and one of them is titled Query Options. And that's the same place you go if you're trying to save the query that you ran or add it to a dashboard. And in that same section, there's a button that says API URLs. And that's the one that you click to access the API. And you'll see that it pulls up 3 different ones, and I think probably most often you're going to want to be using the top one, which is for the actual data that are underlying the time series graph. So that's the one I've kind of highlighted here. And that's the URL that you need to copy. So just do a quick copy on that URL, and then you'll need to save that in whatever program it is that you're using. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I thought it might be helpful to take a minute to just look at the syntax of the API. And the reason I think this is helpful is that there might be times when you want to modify the API rather than going in and generating a new one. And it can be helpful to know how it's structured so that you know how to edit it. And I'm starting with the piece that I change the most, which is the dates of the API. So I've highlighted in blue the sections that are the start and end dates for this particular API. And you can see the syntax is basically like the ampersand if it's coming after some other things, then the column name and equals, and then whatever is the value. So this query currently was set to run August 17th through November 15th. But if you wanted to change that time period, then you could just edit, directly into the API to make that change. So that would be pretty straightforward. And if you kind of want to go to the next level and automate that process, then that can be the type of thing that can help you to do like weekly or monthly data pulls. Okay, the next one I wanted to point out is the difference between an API that is pulling visit counts versus one that's pulling percentage of visits. So the top one has the percent param column equal to no percent, and that one is pulling visit counts. The one on the bottom has that percent param equal to whatever you want to be in your numerator for the percentage, which I think almost always is going to be the kind of condition of interest or whatever the topic area is of your query. In this case, I ran one of the stored CCDD categories in Essence, and so that's what I wanted to put in the numerator of the percent. The denominator would be all the visits that met the other query parameters. So that's kind of where you can make that change between pulling counts and percents. Okay, another place where you could potentially make edits or be interested in making edits might be the topic area of the query. So this one where you see ampersand CCDD category equals, then it's pulling data for a stored definition that's called VDH coronavirus-like illness version 1. And in the API, the spaces in the name are indicated by %20, but you don't have to remember that. It'll, when it generates the API, it does that for you, but just so you can kind of understand what you're seeing in there, I thought that might be helpful to show. And then I think we got one more. Yeah. So there's also a section for the time resolution. And so the top example is pulling daily data, while the bottom example is pulling weekly data. And in essence, you have the option of doing month or quarter or year as well. And if you're not sure exactly what word you need or what column name, then you might want to go to Essence and run the query you want so that you can see it. But I just wanted to kind of highlight where those changes are going to be happening. Any questions about the like syntax of the API or anything like that before we kind of transition over to how to use it in R? Hopefully I haven't lost y'all already. Okay, so my disclaimer about this is that it's not an R training, and I'm not an R expert. And there are lots of resources at our disposal at VDH, including DataCamp, that are available for learning R. But I thought it might be helpful just to show an example of how it can be used. Does Essence have documentation for using the APIs available? I think it's fairly limited, Laurel, but there is a resource document that I'll share the link to when I get a little further into this that's from the National Syndromic Surveillance Program that is pretty helpful. It's sort of focused specifically on R and an R package that I'm going to talk about in a second. So if you're using another software, like if you're pulling it into Excel or something, that resource isn't going to be particularly applicable to you. There's a little bit of information in the Essence user guide, but I think maybe not super detailed. So if you have specific questions, please do reach out, because happy to dig around to find the answer if I don't already know the answer. Okay, and again, I'm going to kind of walk through this in the slides and then do a little demonstration. So if it doesn't all make sense just yet, that's okay. But the first thing that you would need to do is create an R script or an R markdown file, whatever you would be using for whatever project it is, and to load the R packages that you need in order to do the analysis that you're interested in. So that part is the same as any time you would be working in R, apart from Essence. But then you need to install and load a specific package called RNSSP. So that is developed by the National Syndromic Surveillance Program. That's the NSSP part, and the R is for R, of course. And the package does a couple of things. One of them is allowing you to store your Essence user credentials securely. And then in general, it's designed to access the Essence data in the different formats that it is available, and kind of pull it into R for further work. And so the second, I should say the third bullet here is the GitHub site where you can access that package in order to get it downloaded and installed, which I will say some people have run into some issues with installing it, but the developers have been pretty helpful in helping people troubleshoot if they do run into those issues. So don't let that throw you off. And then the guide I was talking about is this second link here on how to use RStudio with NSSP Essence APIs. It's sort of oriented with the national Essence platform in mind, but it applies to the Virginia Essence system as well. So once you have loaded that RNSSP library into R, then you basically need to create your Essence user profile. And the little code snip that I have here is how you do that in R. And what it will do is basically give you a pop-up window that asks you to enter your username and your password. And then there's ways that you can basically store that on your computer so that you wouldn't have to do it every time. You would only have to redo it whenever you changed your Essence password. So, or you can leave it set up like this only, where you would just do it every time that you ran the script. Okay, and so after you have gotten the credentials loaded in, which is going to allow you to actually access Essence, you need to use that API that you copied in from Essence and create an object in R where you're storing that API. So in this little example here, the SNP, I'm calling that URL, and that's how they call it in kind of the training materials. But you could call it whatever you wanted. So if you have multiple APIs and you want a more descriptive name, that's kind of your prerogative in how you're coding things in R. You just need to make sure that whenever you're calling it, that you're calling the right one. So it's basically assigning that whole long API that you copied into that object URL. And so then whenever you want to use the API, you're just using that URL object. And so then this is the step where you're actually pulling the time series data into R. And so you're telling R, I want to use that URL object, which remember is just the API that you copied out of Essence and may or may not have edited, some of those parameters. Use my credentials to get the data from that API. So this is the step that is actually doing the data pull. And if you run into problems with this step, I would say first thing to try is to rerun the beginning part with your credentials in case you accidentally mistyped your password or something like that, because that would definitely stop the program in its tracks. Okay, so then once you do that, and I guess I should back up and say that depending on the complexity of your query and the length of the time period that you're pulling data for, that one that I was just here, I'll go back a second. This step can take a little bit to run it if you're pulling multiple years of data, or if the query is like a free text query where it's having to read through a lot of different things. So you can see R kind of working, and that's fine. It usually doesn't take very long, but just as a heads up in case anybody's trying to pull a big data chunk. Then after that, I think it's a really good idea to double check the structure of your data set and make sure it looks like what you had thought you were pulling. And you can do that either by looking at the data frame directly, or R has this str function, which is basically to just tell you about the structure of the data frame. So that's what I've included a little snip here. So it tells you the different column names, the total number of observations, and then it gives you just a little preview of the, data that are in each of those columns. And I think if you're not super familiar with how Essence has named things, it can be a little bit confusing sometimes. So, for example, what they're calling expected is the expected visit count using a recent baseline. So it's kind of like a regression type of model. And that's how Essence is determining whether there's an alert or not, meaning is this value that we saw, less than 0.05 likelihood of observing that given the recent baseline. So that's kind of what you would see in a typical time series. So that p-value they're calling levels, which I think is a little bit, I guess, not super descriptive and helpful. And what is the alert that shows the yellow or red indications on a time series graph, they call color in the the columns in the data frame that you would pull in from the API. So that just takes a little familiarization, I guess. And then really after that, it's sort of like off to the races to do whatever you would be doing with your data cleaning, analysis, and visualization, otherwise. So I think what I'm trying to focus on today is like how you get the data into your other program. And then after that, really it's more about R skills or whatever program you're working in. And I do want to take a few minutes to talk about some different APIs within Essence, but I'm going to stop for just a sec because I don't want to steamroll over anybody's questions or hesitations, because I know that's kind of a lot, especially if you're not familiar with using APIs or using R. Okay. Please don't hesitate to interrupt or put questions in the chat if you think of something. So the way that I showed you to get the API was for a basic time series graph, but there are other types of data that you can get the API for. And I wanted to show you a few that I think would be of most interest. And one of them is a stratified time series graph. And so for that scenario, you would run the time series graph with whatever, filters and parameters you were interested in. And then when the time series graph is generated and showing in Essence, you would expand out this menu on the upper left that's titled Data Series Options. And then you would choose whatever stratification variable you were interested in. So I think for this example, I chose race. So you would choose race and then click Update to get the stratified graph. And then once that graph generates, then you would go to the API URLs button, which is in the same place as it was before in the under query options, and then copy. Let's see if I have a screenshot. Oh, I didn't screenshot how it looks. Then you just copy the API from there if you want to have the stratified levels. And then you can also do it for tabulated data. So again, you start by just selecting all the query parameters of interest. And then instead of clicking Time Builder in Essence, you would, or what did I say? Instead of clicking Time Series, you would click on Table Builder to get the crosstab options. And you would choose one field for the column and then one or more fields for the rows. And then you expand the query options and get again, that same little button, API URLs. One thing to note about the tables is that you don't actually have to create the table in Essence. You just need to select the column and the rows, and then the API will be correct. So that's just a tip. If you don't want to like wait for it to generate the actual results, you don't need to do that. When you click the API URLs button, you will get a couple of options for the URLs, and they are named for the data structure, so either CSV or JSON. And I would defer to any more data savvy person on the benefits of JSON, but in my experience, that format isn't necessary for most things. The CSV, which is comma separated values, is sufficient. But depending on your use case, I think you might have reasons to use one or the other. So you would copy whichever one, and then you can use it the same way that we use the time series one. And then finally, You can also get APIs for line level data or visit level records. And it's a very similar process. You run the query. Instead of clicking time series or table builder, this time you would click on data details. And then when you expand query options, you have the API URLs available to you. And this one gives you 4 options, the CSV or JSON, and then each of those, they list options for raw or reference values. The raw values means, for example, like sex would be M and F, because that's how it gets sent. The reference values would say male and female. So I think probably most of the time you would want reference values, but again, use whatever is working the best for your particular scenario. Okay. Oh, one other thing about line level that I think is important to mention is that with line level data, I think it's probably most helpful to limit to the columns that you need, because the default has 65 columns. So every record then is 65 columns, and you probably don't need a lot of them. And so you can add to the API using this ampersand field syntax to specify these are the columns that I want. So in this example, the section that I've highlighted in blue is the 4 columns that I'm interested in, which is date, which is visit date, region, which is what Essence calls health district, age, and then CCDD is the combined chief complaint and discharge diagnosis. So then I'm avoiding, pulling the other 61 columns that I don't need for my analysis. So I would definitely recommend doing that. And not only for efficiency's sake, but then you avoid having more PHI, on your computer that you don't actually need. So because remember that Essence line level records have date of birth and name and medical record number and all this stuff. And so my suggestion is to not pull the ones that you don't need. Okay. We can go to that later. So let me pop over here. Is the Essence screen sharing now? Somebody?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Okay. So just want to kind of show you within the system where you can actually find this stuff. So I went to Query Portal to open up this query wizard. And like any other time I'm running a query, I would want to set the time resolution. I would want to set start and end dates. This is counts or percents here, so it's defaulting to visit counts. Perhaps I'm interested in only a certain region for patient location. If I'm a state level user, if you're a district level user, you're only going to see your district data by default. But keep in mind, if you may be interested more in data by where the facility is located, which is the sort of default, or where the patient is located, which you would choose up here, and then you could limit by the patient location. So that's going to give you slightly different numbers because, your district facilities, of course, have patients from other places, and then your residents go to other facilities, sometimes outside of your district. So just to keep that in mind. But anyway, so say I'm choosing a very basic, like respiratory syndrome. So I select that and then run the time series by clicking down here. And hopefully that won't take too long. Okay. And so this is the button that I would go to get the API here. So I just click there, and then I would copy and paste this top section right here. Okay. Any questions about that before I move over to R? Okay. So I have a kind of example script in R. If you're not an R user and you're planning to use the Essence APIs in some other program, feel free to hop off or stay on and listen. It's completely up to you. And just figured it might help to have a little bit of an example of how to use the API. So this R script is just kind of a basic one, but like I was saying when we talked through the slides, you would start by installing whatever packages that you want to use for your for whatever analysis that you're going to be doing. And then you need the R NSSP package, and that's the one that is going to allow you to enter your Essence credentials. So let me see if this will show. I never remember if pop-ups show correctly. Does it show to you, the pop-up window, or no?
Yes, it does.
Oh, great. So you enter in your username, you enter in your password, which it automatically hides. And hopefully I typed it right. We'll find the error message if I typed it wrong. And I don't know if you noticed, but once I did that, it entered this my profile object over in the environment. And so that's what is saving the username and password in a secure fashion. And then remember that we need to take our API that we copied out of Essence and assign it to an object in R. So I'm going to run that. That's called URL. And then this is the portion where we're telling R to use the URL API to get the data. So you can see a little stop sign down here. That is telling you that R is running. And remember, I mentioned sometimes that takes a little while. This time it didn't take very long. What you can see over here is that in the environment, now I have a data frame that's called API underscore data with 91 observations and 8 columns. And remember, I was suggesting that you kind of look at the structure of that data frame just to make sure it looks right to you. And when you do that, the results kind of come down here into the console. So you can kind of just do a quick check, or of course, you can always click it to actually look at it. If you prefer that more like visual look at the data itself. And then you basically are cleaning it and visualizing as you would do for any other data frame. So I'm just going to run a quick example here so you can see. This is basically like daily visit volume. I don't even think there was a limit to what I was pulling here, but I did a little bit of data cleaning just to kind of rename some of the columns. And then I also selected fewer of the columns. So you can see in the clean data set, I only have 4 columns instead of 8 because I didn't need them all. And I also filtered out today's visits. Now, of course, you could do that in the API itself. And actually, I don't think it's relevant to this because I think the date was further back, but it's sort of a data cleaning step you can think about anyway. And then you can do some kind of analysis. So if I was interested in getting kind of the average number of daily visits, for example, this is what I might run. And then if you look at the results of that, which I saved as summary stats, now I have the mean, min, and max of visit volume for ED visits every day during that time period. And I'll just run one other one so you can see kind of what it looks like. So down here is a visualization, which uses ggplot. And so this kind of popped up over here in the plots window. So you can see that's just a way, and I mostly just wanted to illustrate to you kind of what you can end up with once you pull the data into R from Essence. You know, you have a lot more flexibility in customizing the graph compared to the default that's available within Essence itself. So even though this time series would look like basically the same in Essence, here I can, you know, just format things the way that I would prefer. So I think that if you're looking for a little more like flexibility and customization, then this would be a good option for you. And similarly with stratified data as well. So I'm happy to share this example R code with anybody who is an R user and is thinking that they're going to be using R to analyze Essence data. I didn't want to share it with everybody yet because I wasn't sure really how much interest you all would have in this part of it, but I think I'm definitely curious to hear if you all have ideas for how you might use the APIs or questions about it. I think we can kind of open the floor before we wrap up. I will say, while you're sort of pondering, a couple of the reports that come out of central office that include Essence data take advantage of the API to pull. So one of them is the weekly respiratory report, which includes data on like diagnosed flu and diagnosed COVID and things like that. And the other one is the regional GI illness report that actually came out this morning. And so that one uses APIs to pull the percent of GI illness visits for each region. So like if you were interested in, for example, how does my district compare to the GI percents I'm seeing in the region, like you could set one up pretty simply that would just pull that for you every week. So those are just a couple of examples of how they're currently being used in practice. All right. I do have a couple of other tips for you, and then I'm happy to stay on and answer questions if people have them, but we'll kind of wrap things up. So the first is that I would recommend that you test any API that you're trying with a really short date range, just to make sure, like a proof of concept, basically, to make sure it runs before you pull the amount that you're actually trying to use. That way you won't kind of jam things up if it's just too long. And then a reminder, particularly if you're pulling line level data, is that you always need to adhere to the communicable disease data release policy whenever you're sharing out Essence data. So even though you can access it using the API and pull out quite a lot of data, the sort of guardrails on data governance still apply in the same way that they always would. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're thinking forward to what you might be doing. with the APIs. And then I've included some resources here for you, and I'm happy to kind of share out the slides after the fact as well, so that you have those handy. But I will copy the one for the guide from NSSP, because that one's really useful if you're an R user. Yes, Laurel, I will get the R code to you. And it's a pretty basic example, but I'm also happy to answer questions about it and, you know, work through troubleshooting if people have questions. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording, but I will, oh, Colleen, go ahead.
Thank you for doing this. This was very helpful. I was curious, have you tried to do Power BI with the Essence data? Has that been at all successful for you?
I have never tried it, and I've never even used Power BI.
Oh,
So
okay.
if anybody has done that, I would be curious to hear. And also, you know, if that's something you would want to share with other folks, I would definitely be interested in hearing that as well. Has anybody else on the call used it with Power BI or used, I mean, I guess I'd be curious if you use any API with Power BI, because I think it'd be pretty similar.
Yeah, I personally have used API connections in Power BI before, but I haven't successfully been doing it in the Essence environment. So I don't
Got
actually
you.
know how to like set up like the access, because I am like you, like I only know enough to be dangerous, that I am
Right.
not a
Yeah.
well-versed user to say how to like bypass the, getting the username and password to connect correctly for the connections, all that
Okay.
fun stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how helpful I would be, but I'm happy to sort of try to work through it with you. I think if not, I might be able to connect you with some folks at the national level if that's something you really want to dive into, because I would imagine that some of them have used it. Yes, Anna,
Thank
I
you.
will
Yeah,
share the
I don't have a
slides.
pressing need, but I was just curious, to play
Yeah,
around with it to see kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, sounds good.